Okay, well, welcome back. So we're going to carry on with our project today, and what we're going to do is we're going to add resources to it. So we're going to create our resource sheet, and then we're going to assign those resources to the various tasks that make up our project and see what that can give us. We're going to get right in. So this is where we left off. We have our project. It's got its various dependencies integrated into it now, so we can see how it's being scheduled. But what it doesn't have is any resources assigned. So to start assigning resources, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to switch it to the resource sheet. And this is where we would find all of the resources that have been assigned to the project. And the various quantities that they're assigned and what each of them would cost, assuming that you want to have a cost-loaded project, which gives us a great deal of capacity to predict our costs. So the first thing I want to do is to figure out what goes into the resource sheet and the information associated with each of the resources. Now, there's three different kinds of resources that we can input. We can see that here under type. If I drop that down, you can either have work, which is, you want to think of that as labor, if you will, an hourly wage. There's materials, so the consumables that you're going to use, in this project, we're obviously going to consume some hardware, some lumber, drywall, tiles, fixtures, whatnot. And so that would all get put in as material. And then there's cost. And I tend to think of cost, you can assign cost using this line. Where we see it most often is in subcontracts. And so if we have a subcontract, this is where the cost of that subcontract would be captured. So I'm going to enter in one of each, and so we can see what the various fields are for them. And then I will go ahead and populate the rest of the sheet. And so we can go on with assigning those to the various tasks. So the first one that I want to do, so I'm just going to go up here to the resource name, and I'm going to put in a line for our plumbers. And so because our plumbers are labor or work, so the type, by default it offers work, and that's what we're going to want in this case. And I don't need anything then for material. It's not going to actually even allow me to put anything in for material because that doesn't really apply to work type tasks or work type resources. So then I'm going to carry over. So you can choose initials and that different types of reports or screens are going to allow you to have a short form to refer to them. I'm just going to accept the default in this case. You can add a group if you want. So say maybe this, because plumbers are from the trades, maybe we're going to separate our work resources, the office resources, your project managers and your designers or whatnot. Maybe you're going to capture those under a different group than the trades, so we'll just call that trades. And then the maximum tells you how many plumbers you have in your pool available to your resource. So where this becomes really important is if you need to assign, say, 2 plumbers to a particular task. If you have 4, then you're assigning 50% of your pool. If you only have 1, now you're going to be over allocating, or if you have tasks that are overlapping, each requiring a plumber, but you only have 1, now you're going to have over allocated resources. So it's really important to get this right and to make sure that we have the available pool adequately identified. So in this case, we're only going to have 1 plumber working at any given time, and now we're just going to capture the hourly wages, if you will. And now this should be your fully burdened cost to the organization, because this is what it costs you to actually have this individual working. I'm just going to make up some values here. Sorry, $60 an hour. And then it is helpful, certainly, because we may choose to use overtime in order to compress our projects later on. So if you have an overtime wage that you're going to suffer if you assign overtime work, it's good to put it in there. And it may be appropriate to put in a cost per use. Now, in this case, as a cost per use, This particular plumber, we have a special arrangement for him in that he lives some distance away, and so we're going to pay $50 a day for travel expenses. And of course, we're going to pass that on to the client, but we need to capture that expense here. Now, that's not normal for most of them, so that's going to be special in this case. Now, when it comes to the accrual, basically this tells us from a cash flow perspective how these expenses, when they're used, are accrued to the project. And so we have three choices. We can either accrue the expense at the start of the task when they're being used, or we can prorate it over the task as they are consumed, or it can be assigned to the project at the end of the task where they are used. And so depending on what we're doing, we may want to accrue that differently. So in as much as this is labor and they're accruing these expenses as they go along, let's put that in as prorated, and then we get to the calendar. Now, we'll cover calendars specifically later on, but some resources may have a calendar separate or different than the overall work calendar for the project. And this would be a great time to identify that here. So for example, maybe this is a shared resource between a number of different projects, and to make scheduling simpler, you've decided that your project is going to have the plumber available on Mondays and Tuesdays, and somebody else is going to have them on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Not saying that that's a great way to go about it, but you could have a calendar specifically for the resource, and that would help the program understand the scheduling constraints associated with the resource. In this case, we're just going to go with the standard calendar. We'll deal with specialty calendars in a separate video. And finally, the code, if you have a special code for tracking labor or resources or anything else, you can identify that code in there. And in this case, we don't. And so as an example then, I'd like to add a material. So in this case, as an example, I'm just going to choose drywall. We know we're going to have to consume drywall in our task. Now, in this case, it's going to be a material. The initials have been chosen. And what we need to do first, though, is in the material column is we have to put the unit by which we're going to consume them. And so in this case, we're going to choose sheets. It could be square meters, square feet. There's a number of different ways depending on how you're doing your costing and your estimating associated with the use of drywall. So in this case, it's a fairly small project and we're well developed, so we're going to do sheets. And this is going to be just our general mat, general materials in our group. And we don't put in a maximum. You notice that it won't give us that. It's whatever we consume. And now this is, as a standard rate, it's going to ask us what is the cost per unit. So that's the cost per sheet for our drywall. And this is going to be $12 a sheet. And there's no overtime rate. And a cost per use if there's a delivery charge or something like that. And so let's say that there's going to be a $70 delivery charge. And the materials are expected to be paid for when they're delivered to the site, so we're going to want to accrue that at the start of the task when they're delivered. And of course, it's a material, so it doesn't have its own calendar, so we don't have to worry about calendars. So the last type of resource that we're going to put in is one for costs. And a good example of a direct cost is a subcontract. And so we're going to have a subcontract in this case for our cabinets, and we're going to get those from ABC Cabinets. And of course, this is going to be a cost. Now, when we choose cost, we see most of this is just going to disappear. Now, we normally get billed by our subcontractors after their work is done, and so we're going to pay it there. And so let's accrue that at the end of the task in which it is done. And so you notice there's no dollar value put in here in the resource sheet because, of course, we could have several contracts for that, and we can put those in directly on the tasks. And we'll see how to do that in the next section as we add our resources to the tasks. So that's all there is to adding tasks to the resource sheet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring in all of the various tasks or all of the various resources that we're going to need to populate our project. Okay, there you go. I've put in all of the resources on our resource sheet that I think we're going to need for this project. Now, if I forget something or we change something later on, that's no big deal. We can always come back and we can add more resources or take them away if we don't use them. But certainly when it comes to developing our plan, we want to be as comprehensive as we can and get all of our resources into the project where we can. So now we're in a situation where we want to be able to add our resources to our tasks. And so that's going to allow us to figure out the hourly wage, how much those are worth, whether we have enough resources to carry out the scheduled tasks that we have scheduled. All of those sorts of things are going to become available to us once we know which resources are required for which task. If I go back to our Gantt chart, and we see it here, if I open up our sheet a little bit farther, we see resource names, and no resources are being assigned right now to our various tasks. And you can, let me open that up a little bit more. If I went to the drop down, now you see all of our resources show up here in this dialog box, and we can start to assign them to the various tasks. So for example, it may be of value for us to assign our project manager or a percentage of our project manager to the overall task. That'll save us some hassle of having their time attributed to individual tasks as we go along. So that's one way to do it on a small project like this. On a larger project, I think you are going to want to capture the various project management tasks and assign the various resources to it. But we're going to do that. Now the problem here is if I just assign the project manager by checking it, you'll see, so we're going to do one quick change. So if I want to assign resources to our summary task, that needs to be deliberately put in by us. It can't be the logical dummy task, if you will, that the program can provide. So we're going to add a task. Oh, sorry. Got to delete this. So we're going to add a task in here. Insert task. And that will be our bathroom renovation. And there we go. We're going to make all of this subordinate to it. So I'm going to indent it under tasks. I'm going to choose indent. And you see our work breakdown structure has been adjusted. And then I'm going to go back. To our format tab, and I'm going to turn off the project summary task. And so now we've basically provided our own project summary task in here, because in this case I've chosen as my method to assign some resources directly to the project overall. And so that's going to allow me to do that. So let's get to where we were. We had the project manager selected. If I hit enter, 100% of the project manager is assigned to the overall project. Now, this is a pretty small project, so it's unlikely that we're going to have the project manager dedicated 100% of the time to this task. This is likely just one of many projects that they're going to be assigned to. So a small project like this is probably more reasonable that they're only going to give 10 or 15% of their time to this little project. And so that method of entry, it was not really useful to us when it came to assigning that resource, because now it's not really assigned the way we want. So there are a number of ways we can do this. So let's just here, I'm going to bring in my entire project. So remember the details box, and there's a number of ways that we can bring it out. Let's go back to task. We've got details chosen here, and we can go down in the details, and you can see in this particular view, and we know that we can adjust how that is shown. We see resources here, and so our project manager is listed under those resources, and we can see that they're giving 128 hours of work, which is that 16 days to the project. And we could adjust this down to be some other amount of hours that we want. So the other thing we can do, let's turn off details for a second and just bring up our task sheet. Sorry, I didn't get my details turned off. Turn off the details. Bring up our dialog box for our task. And when we look at resources, we can see them in here. And this is a really useful way in which we can add these resources. And so we have the project manager, but we see that they're added the full unit or 100% of their time. And so if we only wanted them to have 15% of their time, for example, we can put them in as 0.15 or 15%, and that will change how much of their time is committed to that project. And we see that back here in the resource sheet, we see that they're only committed 15% of the time. And we're going to go ahead and add resources for all of our tasks. And again, I'm just going to do it by bringing up that resource sheet or the task information sheet and go to the individual resources. So in our plan, the resource that we need is going to be our designer. And we're going to use the designer complete for that task. And we're good to go there. And because we're using 100%, it might have been just as easy to do the drop-down box here, choose the designer, and go from there. So you got a couple different choices on how you can put these resources in for each of the individual tasks. So I'll do one more, and then I'm just going to go ahead and populate it. So if we go to the demolish the existing bathroom, so in this case, we're just actually going to be using our labor pool. And so we need to identify our laborers. And in this case, we're going to need 2 of them to do the work. Now, keep in mind that when we're assigning resources to these, the resources that we're adding are the resources that you assumed when you chose the duration of the task. Okay, so we've identified that demolish existing bathroom is going to take 1 day, and we've assigned 2 laborers to it. So when we chose 1 day, we knew, or we had it in the back of our mind, that we were estimating the time it was going to take to do that task based on the labor pool that we were going to assign to it. And we can change all of that, and we can adjust it. But as we move forward, if we're going to adjust it up or down, add more effort to it to reduce the time, we're going to have to link those together. So in the first instance, our estimate in time is tied to our estimate in resources. So let's look at some of the other resources. So we've added some labor. Let's add some materials to the project. So if we go down to the drywall task, we see down here it's going to take us 3 days. So if I open up its task information sheet just by double clicking on it, and we go to the resources. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to have our labor pool that's going to do the drywalling. And in this case, we have finishers that we're going to use, and we're going to use 2 of them over the duration. And so we can put those in there, but we also actually need to assign the drywall to it. And depending on how specific you are in mud and tape and that, or those can be just considered shop supplies. So we're going to have to add drywall, and we know that that's going to take 12 sheets of drywall, and we can put that in there. And so we hit OK, and we can see the resources being applied up there. And we will look later as to how the costs are accrued based on those different resources. Some are material and some are labor. So the last one that I wanted to go, remember we put in that subcontract for the bathroom cabinets. And so if I go down to the install cabinets, that's being done. The installation, everything is being done by subcontract. And so let's bring up the resource here, the resource sheet, go to resources, and we're going to do that. Where is it? ABC cabinets. And the cost associated with that is $4,000. And so that's installed. And so we can just type that in. Now, if we had multiple tasks that the same contractor was working on, we would just assign the portion of the contract that we have that covers off that task to it and make sure that they all add up to the overall cost of the contract. Okay, sometimes you save the best for last, and as we've been talking about, there's 1,000 different ways of doing just about everything in this program. So we've been looking at a couple different ones for entering resources. So before I go ahead and just fill out the rest of the resources assigned to this project, there's one last method that I wanted to show you, and that's by bringing up a dialog box similar to the task information sheet. However, we're going to go to resource, and we're going to choose assign resources, and that brings up this, what I think of as a very special dialog box. And so I can just put it up here out of the way. And what's special about it is when you had the task information sheet open, you had to open it for each task and you had to close it before going on to the next task. The nice thing here is that if I'm on stud walls, then I can fill this out and get information, and then I can go on to rough-in plumbing, and the box just updates itself. It's kind of like the details sheet down at the bottom. And so it can be a little bit more efficient when it comes to filling out your resources. So it works the same as everything else, and it's probably the nicest way to do this. So for example, if we're doing the stud walls and I wanted one carpenter, so I can just go in here and choose one carpenter. Probably need, I don't know, 25, down here I probably need a bunch of 2x4s. Let's put in, say, 25 2x4s, and you can see how it's updating the cost. Even updating the dialog box itself, it doesn't wait until you hit OK. It just automatically goes ahead and does the update, which can be really, really effective when you're doing a whole bunch of tasks. And then I would just switch to another task, like rough-in plumbing. And so I'm going to need a plumber. So I just scroll down here until I find a plumber. There's my plumber. And so I'm going to choose one plumber. And you'll note it'll bring it right up to the top of the box now. And he's going to need some pipes. So we'll go down here, we'll find some PEX. And let's give him, say, 30 meters of PEX to work with. And you see that the unit will match whatever unit you put in your resource sheet for that thing. And you can go very quickly through a variety of tasks and enter in most of their resources that they need. So now I'm just going to pop out very quickly, populate the rest of the tasks so we can go on and finish this particular tutorial. Okay, there you go. I've just gone and assigned all of our materials and resources to the various tasks where they're going to show up in our project. And that's going to empower us to both see how costs are accrued throughout the duration of the project and what our cash flow requirements are going to be, as well as look at the individual resources and to see if we have an adequate pool of resources that we don't have to adjust our schedule. If, on the other hand, we are short resources for the schedule as it was determined by the project, we're going to have an over-allocation and we're going to have to adjust for that. Now, what do we see? Of course, we have all our resources in here. When I look over to the left here, we see in our indicator box, some indicators have popped in. And so when I bring up the dialog box, it says this task has been over allocated. And so right off the bat, we know that we're going to have a shortage of resources in order to accomplish the project as currently scheduled. And so we're going to have to manage that. And we're going to deal with that in the next video on doing resource leveling and taking care of those over allocations. So there are a couple views that I think we want to see just so that we see some of the power in assigning all of our resources here. So I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to go through a couple. So the first one we talked about was resource calendars and how we can adjust that. We haven't done that yet, but we'll do that in a separate thing. But let's look at what we have. So we have resource forms, and so you can see particular resource and all of the tasks that it's assigned to. And so that may be useful when you're trying to look at the actual allocations and make sure you have it right and haven't missed anything. in this view, we can see a graph of the usage of our various resources over the duration of the project. And in this case, we have our project manager giving up 15% of each day towards the project. And it's shown out here in accumulation of bar charts. Now, if it were over allocated, in this case, it's not because it's only 15% of their time, it would show in a combination of blue and red when it goes over that, or when it exceeds the pool of available resources. So I'm just going to use my mouse scroll wheel, and I'm going to scroll down, and I can go through all of our different resources and look at how they're allocated over the project. So here, I'm just going to bring this onto the screen. So it was just off the screen there. We know that our finishers are actually over allocated because of the various tasks that are overlapping. And so this is a chore that we're going to have to manage before we finalize and baseline our schedule, is we're going to have to deconflict these over allocations and otherwise level out our resources so that we're living within our allocation. Alternatively, if it's appropriate, we could choose to increase our pool of resources if that was appropriate for a particular project. Resource usage, this is particularly handy. You can see it in terms of hours, the various resources here, and how many, what is being used at different time frames, is including over allocations, which show up in red. So the final thing that I want to show before we bring this video to an end is just the accumulation of our cash flows, because that's a real powerful tool this software is going to give us now that we've tied our materials and costs and labor to the actual tasks that they're working on. And so to do that, what I want to do is I'm going to go to the Report tab, and I'm going to bring up one of our dashboards, which is just to look at our cost overview. Now, that doesn't look particularly interesting as it is right now, because I haven't really set it up for the project. If this is by default, I think it uses quarters, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm going to focus in on this graph here. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to change the time scale. So we see up here that it is time is the category, and I'm going to choose edit. And instead of using weeks as my unit, I'm going to use days. And bring the count down to 1. And so now we can start to see the accumulation of costs over the projected cost lengths. And so this is really our baseline. Now we haven't included any contingencies or anything else like that. So it's not the full up budget, but it's starting to get close, and it's a pretty good estimate of our cash flows. Now you may find that that's too much granularity to count in every day. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense. We can smooth it out by going every 2 days or every 3 days, whatever is appropriate for your overall project. So that's really what we wanted to cover in this video. We're back in our Gantt view. You can see each of the tasks showing the resources that are assigned to them. You can turn off the labeling depending on whether it's starting to crowd up your Gantt chart or not. We still know that we have some over allocations that we're going to have to manage. They're showing up in our indicators field over here, but that's all to come as we get closer and closer to our baseline, which can allow us to start the execution of our project. So come on back, and in the next one, we're going to look at some of these over allocations and see if we can't rectify the issues that are currently in our schedule.